Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Young Black Suburban. I'm your host, Kaitlin Files. I'm a young, white, female-identifying lawyer who lives in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly. This podcast runs as a sister show to Young Black Suburban, hosted by Tim Witherspoon Jr. The Young Suburban podcast hosts guests to engage in conversation about their different life journeys and perspectives. My show, Young Blonde, has a special focus on badass babes out there doing the damn thing. So welcome and thank you for tuning in. Let's jump into today's episode. Raphael Castro, I'm so excited to have you here. How are you, bud?
Thank you so much, Katie, for having me. I'm so excited to be on your podcast today.
So I wanted to have you for a few reasons. One of the reasons is because you're young lawyer like I am, and you're in your 30s, right?
Yes.
Okay. But you've had a few very cool jobs already throughout your legal career. So I think it'd be cool to talk about the type of work that you've been doing before I met you, while we were working together, and then since then, but also to have you essentially for representation. And, you know, something that we work on at a nonprofit together, The Right Legacy, is teaching kids that no matter what they look like or where they come from, they too can be lawyers or work in the legal field, even though the legal field, as we know, is primarily dominated by white men. We are not white men. And I think it's important for kids to see that you can do it too. So I'm so happy to have you here, and I want to hear about your journey to becoming a lawyer. So let's start, where are you from?
So I'm from Philly. Both of my parents are from the Dominican Republic, and they wanted to have a better life for me. And when they both got here when they were high school, they didn't know any English. So they took a bunch of ESL classes while they were in high school, and they met each other at Burger King. And my dad was a supervisor there and hit on her, and I was made. And then
Wait, was she an employee at the time too?
She was, yes.
Oh, that's a scandal.
It is a scandal. Employment law issues. And he decided that he wanted to have more stability. So he joined the Navy, and he did that for about 8 years. We were stationed at a couple different bases across the country, Texas, Kentucky, and then ended up in Philadelphia, down at the Naval Yard in South Philly. My mom grew to love Philly, and she really enjoyed it here. And she was like, we're not moving back to New York. Like, this is our home. Mm-hmm. So grew up in South Philly and had an amazing childhood. And I didn't really necessarily knew what I wanted to be in life. Mm-hmm. I knew I did okay enough in school, but there were so many other people who were so much smarter than me. And I went to a all-boy Catholic high school that kind of put me in the right mind frame of Roman Catholic.
You went to Roman?
Brought in Vine. And I got accepted into Temple, which was like my dream school, even though I got accepted into other Ivy League schools. Oh, wow. And I was undeclared. I didn't know, I really didn't understand like what I wanted to do in life. I knew I wanted to help others. And I did a bunch of internships. And then my first internship was actually at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. So undeclared, I actually didn't know any attorneys at all, like none of my family. My grandmother has a third grade education. Both of my parents just came here from Dominican Republic. And I got to see some like badass lawyers. I got to see like, trial attorneys, putting up juries, putting up victims of heinous crimes, them advocating in a jury. And I like fell in love with it. And I was like, I think this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I actually interned there 3 separate times throughout college and law school.
Really? Wow.
Mm-hmm. And I got to like really dive in and meet a lot of great mentors and a lot of friends, I would say, that are my friends today. And I was lucky enough after law school, after going to Widener, that they gave me an offer, but I did a clerkship with President Judge Wood Skipper, well, formerly President Judge Wood Skipper in City Hall, who's also a former DA. And I did that for about 9 months. And then I was a district attorney in Philly for about 3 years, which was an incredible experience before meeting you.
Yeah, I mean, you have a very cool journey to becoming a lawyer. So it was actually the DA's office that made you want to be a lawyer.
Yes,
Okay.
I saw that as a prosecutor, you have the opportunity to affect both sides of the bar. So not only are you advocating for victims of property and violent crime, and negotiating through the system with them, and letting them know about what's going on with their case, and how they need to testify at a future hearing. But also the other side, I've had plenty of talks with people who were charged with crimes, defendants, and really giving them second opportunities, and negotiating pleas, and making sure justice was done. That was my main thing.
Mhm.
I was really considering becoming a public defender, and I actually did an internship with the Defenders Association as well.
You're
And
all over the place.
I was all over the place, and I still am. And I
Sure.
realized that I can make more impact as a DA, because they have the power to actually bring forth charges, negotiate charges, and decide if trial or some type of other disposition is necessary.
That's interesting you say that because we met doing workers' compensation law and I still do it. But at some point when we were at that firm, I got an offer to do work comp law to represent the insurance companies. And I remember talking to my dad about it and I was like, I just don't think I can do that. Like, it just doesn't sit well with me. Like, it's just not who I am. And he was like, you might actually be able to be more helpful on the side of the insurance companies because you can actually try to help out the injured workers and actually make sure the case runs right. Obviously, I didn't go that route, but it was an interesting perspective. And what you're saying about the DA's office is kind of like that. When you're at the DA's office, you know, I hate when people ask me when they hear you represent injured workers, like how many people fake it. I hate that question. It drives me nuts. But at the DA's office, when we represent clients, we have to represent them no matter our personal feelings on the matter. I would imagine that's tough in criminal law. Was there
Similar.
anything? Yeah, it's similar, but it's got to be pretty tough at times when you have to represent your client, but you may not necessarily agree with what's going on. Does that ever happen, or while you were there?
All the time. And I'm sure we'll talk about workers' compensation, but sometimes we don't necessarily have someone who we're advocating who has like the white hat, who is totally innocent, and we feel like they have the best case ever. That's why, as a prosecutor, you're employed by the city, or if you're working with the Attorney General's office or with the U.S. Attorney's office at a state or federal level, you're your constituents are the people. And sometimes when bringing forth charges, it wasn't necessarily the victim's mission or what the victim wanted to do. So for example, for a few months I was assigned to family violence sexual assault unit, that had to deal with victims of domestic abuse,
Mhm.
victims of sexual violence. And what I often found was that most victims, the vast majority of them, they knew the perpetrator. So it was always the uncle, the boyfriend, the neighbor, and there's a lot of mixed feelings, because you don't necessarily want to get that person in trouble, but at the same time, you want to make sure that there's accountability.
Mhm.
So a lot of times it was really tough in bringing forth people who wanted to speak their truth in court. Or violent crime, right? A lot of the talk this past year in the pandemic is police reform, and also the caveat of like, how do we make our city safer? And one of the things that we found this past year was like crazy gun violence, right? But what's the gun violence, right? It's typically turf wars, drug dealers, and people with black hats, not white hats, right? So a lot of times I would have victims who were drug dealers who kind of got too close to one block, and it was tough work, but we had to bring justice when there wasn't innocent parties all around. So it's tough work, but it was great work when I did it.
And I can see what you're talking about, especially I'm very in tune with women who are suffering domestic abuse or sexual assault just because I'm a female. So I try to pay attention to that type of stuff going on. But women are very reluctant when that does happen because, like you're saying, it typically is someone they know. And it's hard to then have that woman come out and speak out against a friend, a family member, just someone that they're connected to. That's tough work. I commend you for it. You were there 3 years?
3 years,
Right.
yes.
And then why'd you leave? I mean, I know what happened after, but why'd you leave?
So I think I left because when I fell in love being a prosecutor when I was like an undeclared Temple student, I had a different mindset and I had different goals. So when I got into the work, I wanted to be a trial attorney, and I still love being a trial attorney. I wanted to try juries. I wanted to get real life experience, and I wanted to advocate for those who couldn't. And it's a public service position with the government, and you start to realize that there's bills like student loans. You start to realize that you want to buy a home.
Hmm.
You start to realize that you want to start a family. And I started to realize that I could still do what I love to do in the courtroom and advocating for others, but in the private sector.
Hmm.
And I think civil law really interested me and had the same type of litigation in regards to being in court, doing depositions, and really having that communication with clients.
Right.
So I think that's what interested me. But I think if if the public sector kept up financially with the private sector, you would still probably be speaking to a prosecutor. And I think most prosecutors leave solely for that reason.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you entirely. I thought I was going to go into juvenile justice law. I interned at the Juvenile Law Center, as we can talk about how we definitely connect on that. But I interned there, and I remember being like, I don't want to do this. Like, this is not what I would like really pictured for my life. I love working with kids, and I am very passionate about juvenile justice reform, but like, this is not what I want for my life. But then I found work comp, which kind of married the two together, which is you feel like you're helping people, you're representing injured workers who need help, but also you're in the private for profit sector. So, you are living that kind of like lawyery lifestyle that people think is how all lawyers live, which is not how all lawyers
No, not at all.
live.
But
Not
but
at
what
all.
but one important thing, so I did an exit interview with all my supervisors and all my mentors at the DA's office, and I was really upset to the point of tears because I knew that, this was definitely an experience that will shape my life forever, and I didn't know if I was necessarily making the right decision.
Mhm.
And Kelly Hodge, who was the district attorney at the time when I left, she was the first African American woman district attorney in the state of Pennsylvania, which is kind of crazy to me, during this time.
I mean, it's
Um,
awesome for her, but also like, really? That's how long it
yeah, really, yeah. And she gave me a lot of good advice, and she said that your work doesn't stop. You know, we talked before we jumped on the Zoom and started recording. We talked about the partnership that we have with the Right Legacy, and I think things like that outside of the courtroom, I mean, that can have like a vast change for like any in one young person's life. The work that we're trying to do. So she talked about all these programs, and I said to myself, I can do this, you can do this outside of the courtroom, not even as an attorney. So I'm not in public interest law anymore, but I think we have the public interest mindset.
I agree. And I think that's something, Jenna King, I'm like, oh, which is her married name now? Jenna in the work comp world, and she's also very tuned in to the juvenile justice and the social justice reform. Um, and we were talking, she was on the podcast last week, and she was talking about how, work comp doing this type of law or doing any really type of litigation side, you can have more free time and more flexibility. And so even though we're representing injured workers, I spend most of my day talking to Jenna about what we're doing for the Philadelphia Bar Association and how we're getting involved in the community and doing the mock trial and bringing the books to the kids about reading how to become a lawyer, and spending most of my time working on the Right Legacy, which, by the way, everyone listening should go follow the Right Legacy. It is a new nonprofit. It just got its 501c3 status. But it's
Super
our good
exciting.
friend. It's very exciting. Our good friend Chris Fox set it up, and it's a nonprofit organization. And Raph and I are in charge of writing the curriculum, but we are going into schools in Chester County and teaching kids about the tenets of the law and giving them practicums to practice being lawyers. And we'll be in there teaching them. So I'm excited.
So exciting.
I know.
And so when I was mentioning about like police reform and social justice, it's like it's been like such like a hot topic. And I think kids are genuinely interested in law, but we're probably in my shoes where like they didn't know where to start, they didn't know any attorneys. And with all of the police unjustified shootings that's been happening, since we started as attorneys. Trayvon Martin was when we were in law school,
Yep.
up until Eric Gardner, Mike Brown, Sandra Bland, Tiana Taylor, George Floyd. People are interested, people want to know, and people want change. So what I found, how do you change the system is you become part of that system. So I think the Right Legacy is going to help kids understand the law and possibly inspire someone to go into law. So I mean, I'm just like so excited because if we can like really interest one student, then it's worth it.
100% worth it, especially if there's one kid who didn't know that they could go to law school before or didn't really understand. Civil rights laws are tough to understand, and people think like certain things that are incorrect, but to get in there to actually explain concepts of the law, I didn't have any lawyers in my family. I had no idea anything about law school growing up. And no one came to talk to us about being lawyers. So I think it's really cool. Chris Fox is doing an awesome job with it. He's going to have to be on here and talk about the Right Legacy. Even though he's a white man, we'll have him on to talk about the Right Legacy.
I'll tune in and I'll listen. I can't wait.
So anyway, so then you left, you came and to my firm where I was working at the time, and we worked together like 3 years, 2-3 years at least, right?
3 years, yeah.
Representing injured workers, and we both were part of the COVID layoff from that firm about a year ago, and then both went our separate ways. But you went into a really cool field. So tell me about what you're doing now.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough where I know a lot of people are hurting around the world, and workers can't find any type of income. But we were super lucky where we found our own opportunities, and really excited where I'm at. So I'm at the law offices of Eric A. Shore. and it's mostly an employment law firm, and they're based in Voorhees, New Jersey. But we also have an office in Philadelphia where I practice in, right outside of City Hall slash Love Park. I handle mostly
Cool spot.
personal injury and workers' compensation. I would say it's probably 80% of my practice. So personal injury would be negligence, intentional torts, motor vehicle accidents, premises liability, some medical malpractice. And for workers' compensation, which you handle 100% still to this day with your own practice. Um, and also, I handle a little bit of civil rights, which I would say is 10% of my practice, in addition to employment law, which I'm learning a lot about.
Wow.
Which our former colleague Erica Shikanoff,
Hmm.
who I learned a lot from. I always wanted to handle a few employment law cases, and this firm has given me the opportunity to do so. So it's been great because I've seen how employment law, workers' compensation, social security, disability, how they all interconnect, because they don't, even though we kind of practice our own little silos within our last firm, it does really affect, and it's also really interesting how different causes of action can really affect each different lawsuit. So that's my practice, and I've been excited to continue to represent clients in that capacity.
Yeah, it's really cool that, like you said, I only do work comp. I forever see myself only ever doing work comp. I'm just a work comp girl. But it's cool that you added on the employment law and the civil rights side of things, because I didn't realize how many people, I can't believe how many civil rights things I've already sent you, because I didn't realize how many people call with civil rights issues. Now, I don't know how much of that is actually a feasible case or what you guys take on, but you do hear these stories of people calling in and telling stories. And I'll be on the phone for like 45 minutes. I don't even take these cases. I don't practice the law, but just listening to what happened, you're like, oh my God, what happened? What's going on? It's crazy. Some of these things that are happening to people out there. It's
Yeah, I think I've always come from the standpoint of I think you can both be for police reform, but also social justice. So you can support the police and also hold police accountable. A lot of my friends are police officers, but I think it's just like any other profession where you might have some bad apples,
absolutely.
and I think as mentioning keeps coming up, but with like 2020, it's kind of put like a big spotlight on you know what is the role of police, and what happens when there's police misconduct and brutality. So I think there's been a shift in regards to the public consensus and also public knowledge of what the law is. Also, everyone has a camera on their phone, so when there's instances of excessive use of force, or if there's like clear issues of racial profiling, literally people upload it, onto YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and it becomes a national story within hours.
Yeah.
So, so I think now there's a lot more knowledge about what people's rights are, and then also there's corroboration with now the use of camera phones.
And it's interesting you bring up, I mean, how, talking about police officers, because there's been like a huge split where people think you either like don't like the police and you don't want to support them, or you're pro police, no reform. And it's like, no, you can still want police reform and still support the police. I mean, I never wanted to be a police officer because I'm terrified of the job. They have a scary job.
Very scary. I
Yeah,
wouldn't
it's
be able
very
to do it either.
scary. Right. It's very, it requires a lot to go out there every day and to do that, but to ignore that there's something wrong, like the actual structure or the policies of the police are promoting systemic racism. It's just putting your head in the sand. It's absurd. Like you can support soldiers and want them to be protected and safe, but also not support a war. Like, that people
Exactly.
like think you
Yeah.
can't do the both things. And it's just, I had a friend be like, why can't I support the police but also want reform? I was like, you can. You're allowed to do that. People just act like all police are bad or all police are good. And like you said, that's just such a gross stereotype. It's like lawyers. So many people hate lawyers. And I'm like, all right, well, we're not all terrible.
Yeah, right, right. It's like if you go to a dentist and you have like a horrible experience, right? Like it was just one bad dentist, right?
Yeah.
But it's magnified with the police force because they do have to protect and serve us. And when
Everyone,
it
fairly and
when
equally.
it doesn't happen, people have to be held accountable. But
Yes.
I mean, I could talk all day about this. I recently hosted a panel with Commissioner Daniel Outlaw, who's our current Philly police chief, and she's incredible. And she really talks about that the police is a community, and the things that she wants to change is not necessarily policy change, but more of a culture change.
Hmm.
Um, and and we did speak about policy, but there's restraints about like what we can and can't do. So, for example, like people don't know Act 111, and essentially it's how police are disciplined. So I'm sure you see in the news all the time, like, hey, a police officer was drunk driving and he killed someone, so now he's suspended without pay. Suspended? Like, why isn't he like fired? Like, what's the issue here?
Hmm.
So there's really, really strong police arbitration rules that are at the state level, and those things have to be changed at Harrisburg and not necessarily in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of important talk, but I know that we have the right leadership in place, and I'm glad that we're starting to have that conversation.
Yeah.
But this conversation is definitely initiated by young people. I don't think in our generation we were like so engrossed in it, which I'm so happy with.
You can definitely see a change coming. And I think it's kind of like what you said, everything is being filmed now, so it's people are actually seeing it. It's not like any of this is really new stuff. It's just that we're all sitting at home with nothing to do and people are filming these injustices that are happening, and it's like, oh my gosh, like you can't really ignore this. You have to pay attention about what's going on. And I feel like there's some part of, you know, privilege going in. Like, I'm not scared to call the police.
Mm.
But I know people are scared to call the police if something is going on because of the way that they look. And I like that approach that the police should be more of the community and you should know your police officers and you shouldn't be scared to call them because you're not sure what's going to happen when they arrive. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah.
it's a communication issue. I think at the end of the day, right? If you grow up in West Philly or North Philly, and all the experiences that you have with the police are bad, right? Like they're in their cop cars. Anytime they're in the neighborhood, they're coming and arresting, people that I hang out with. They don't really care about me.
Right.
So it's kind of like it's like what do you expect? Like what do you think's going to happen when some stuff goes down and you don't necessarily want to call the police?
Yeah.
But a lot of the police like live in those same neighborhoods. So I think it's about getting that communication out, better recruitment in regards to diversity.
Yeah.
Um, really, really important for the future.
And I think investing, those communities are, there's so much police there, but there's not also access to mental health and things like that. It's about, making sure that the communities are properly invested in, and it's not just let's throw more police at the problem. um, it's cool you're doing this work though. It's really cool. How, um I guess, well, I guess you just started. I was going to say, has there been an uptick at all in 2020 in this type of work, at least
I
in
think
Philly?
so. Yeah, I think there is. I think there is because, like I mentioned before, I think people are aware of what their rights are. And I think that also translates into what decision makers within the courtroom will do,
Mhm.
aka juries and judges. So I think back in the day, everyone respects officers, but I think it was to a different extent because no one would ever dispute what a police officer said. But I think now there's like a healthy skepticism. Are they really telling us the truth?
Mhm.
So I think more and more people are aware of, if I have been wrong, maybe I should reach out to someone in regards to speaking to this issue. And that's where like civil rights work comes in.
Right. And really just like holding the police accountable for behavior and actions and whatnot. And I think it's important. I have a question about something, and like this is like such a lawyer question. And I
Yeah.
probably should know the answer, but I don't. So, I have my friend's law firm is representing Jacob Blake and his family, and that was the Wisconsin shooting that left the young man paralyzed essentially from the waist, or I think from the neck down. But he does personal injury law. And so he's representing him on that. In a case like that, would there be a civil rights lawyer like working with? I mean, I guess this should be a question for him, but I'm going to ask you anyway because you both. Would there be a civil rights lawyer working with a personal injury lawyer, or is it mainly just a personal injury type issue?
So I think most likely your friend is working in conjunction,
Mhm.
um, and making sure that they get the right conclusion,
Right.
for Jacob. So from what I remember, Jacob was shot 7 times, 7 or 8 times. Jacob, who's African American, the police officer who's Caucasian, while responding to a domestic incident.
Mhm.
And this happened late last summer. And essentially, from what I understand, there's a pending civil rights lawsuit for excessive force in federal court.
Okay.
Um, from civil rights cases are really tough. They're really tough against specifically law enforcement because there's a thing called qualified immunity.
I was hoping you would talk about this.
Yes, and with with qualified immunity, it essentially gives the standard is that it gives leeway to law enforcement officers because they understand the type of work that they do.
Mhm.
So these are high risk, high violence situations where they have to make a decision um, within a split second. So it's the understanding that so long as there's no type of intentional involvement, which is completely different than torts law, because torts is more negligent. So, like, what would a reasonable person do in this situation?
Right.
It's such a high burden, and typically the results or like a specific disposition that you would like from a civil rights lawsuit is change within the department, unless you can prove some type of intentional action in this case. With the case of Jacob Blake, in regards to the civil rights aspect, I think it's super interesting because in this case, the officer shot at Jacob 7 times. It's very excessive. If anyone's held a firearm in their hand, pulling that trigger 7 times, at what point did it become self defense, and then at what point did it become, intentional?
Mhm.
um, for the personal injuries aspect of it, I think that's super interesting because then you would be suing the officer as an individual and not within his capacity as an officer.
Mhm.
And essentially, you're looking just like a workers' compensation case. You're looking for, what's he's missing, what's the damages. So, from what I understand, he's a paraplegic, as you mentioned. So, what type of medical bills, hospitalizations, physical therapy, things that Jacob Blake would need to have for the rest of his life. Also for his lost wages if he
Right.
was working. Also loss of consortium.
Mhm.
If he had a significant other and he was providing for the significant other. Also financial support for his family, for any dependents, any children that he was taking care of, and most importantly, that I didn't know about in the workers' comp system that you can do in personal injury is pain and suffering, which is huge. Pain and,
Huge.
pain and suffering,
which we don't
is
get in work
huge.
comp.
Yeah, which we should.
We should.
Um, but pain and suffering is unquantifiable,
Mhm.
right? Like what's it worth to you to lose your legs for the rest of your life,
Right.
right? So once if your friend can convince the decision maker that there should be some type of accountability in the Jacob Blake case, then the second question that the decision maker would have, and I'm not sure if he's going jury or judge, the second decision they would have to make is damages, right? So like what kind of
Yeah.
what's the number that you would put on this type of case? I know that I believe it was the Eric Gardner case. I think they settled out of court for like 15 million. I'm assuming it's going to be
Which
an
doesn't
eight.
even seem that much, to be honest.
No, not at
I'm
all, right?
shocked at that. Yeah.
But I'm assuming it's got to they got to be talking somewhere in the 7 to 8 figure realm
Oh yeah.
in regards to damages.
Absolutely. And like that's another thing is, you know, police reform people should be also looking at what the cities are paying out for these horrible, horrible cases that happen. But these are millions and millions and millions of dollars. That if we if we try to reform the system, I mean, these families wouldn't be going through these horrible experiences. I mean, it's just crazy. It's just, we live in quite the time.
I know. And there's been a lot of talk of that actually, like taxpayers are pissed, right? Because that's typically like a conservative issue, right? It's like, why should a taxpayer be paying for the police misconduct when it's clearly intentional? And it's coming off the coffers of like, people who are paying their real estate taxes. So
Right.
I know for like Breonna Taylor, that's a Kentucky case, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, she was.
So these are like southern states that have to deal, with these type of issues. Hundreds of lawsuits every year. City solicitors who have to defend them on the city dime. At what point is like enough is enough, and do like police officers individually become responsible? I know there's been a lot of talk of having like a separate like police insurance fund. That's been like a big talk, but it would have to be
Very, very well funded.
very well funded by police officers,
But
right? So
it's also sad that people are finally like, enough is enough, because their financial bottom line is being affected, not that these people are being unjustly killed. It's that, oh, I don't want my tax dollars to pay for this anymore. Like, oh, not surprising.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, Bref, it was so awesome to have you on here today. I really appreciate your time. Something I ask people when we close out the show is, what is something that brings you joy?
Oh, something that brings me joy. That's a good question. I love that question.
Thank you.
Um,
I love hearing the
I
answer.
yeah, I think seeing other people succeed. So, to flip your question, I was having a debate with my dad, who I would consider him like to be my greatest mentor in my life. And we were talking about like, what's your fears? And I said, my biggest fear is like failing. Like I hate failing. I hate when I can't like toast something correctly, or I hate when I take a case of decision and it's a negative result.
Oh, that's the worst.
And then I realized that we're in the business of litigating, and there's winners and losers. But at the end of the day, some of the best joys that you receive is something like that's outside of the courtroom. It's just like literally just people succeeding. So when we settle a case outside of court, and we have that conversation with a client about them resigning from their employer, and sometimes the insurance company doesn't want to pay for like a specific medical bill, I've kind of changed those discussions into like into joys of succeeding. And we have to be advocates for our clients, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like that they're winning in the case. I just had a client who I settled last week, the strangest case ever. She worked as a cricket warehouse manager, and in order for the crickets to be thriving and to live.
Oh, actual crickets? I thought you meant
actual
cricket,
crickets.
like the mobile service or
actual crickets.
Got it.
Actual crickets. They have to be placed within 95 to 100 degrees humidity, and this is like out in like York, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And the warehouse itself started to develop black mold, like serious black mold to the point where you can literally like see it and like scrape it from the corners. And she developed some serious like asthma and respiratory related issues. And that was the case that I wanted to bring to decision, but we ended up getting a pretty good settlement on it. And it's strange because they don't necessarily have like a judge's order. They don't necessarily have like their final day in court where they get to talk about, why they won. Mm-hmm. It was her birthday when we settled the case, and she was just like in tears. She was just like so happy that we were able to get like just like a little bit of money that can like make her feel, you know what, there's a conclusion to my case. Or even like seeing like a good friend that you haven't seen in a long time. Like little joys in life is seeing like people succeed. And I think we're conduits of that. So for me, joy for me is like seeing other people happy, seeing other people succeed. And I think that's why I'm so excited to do the work that we both do, is because like we have that capacity that not a lot of people have that responsibility to do so.
And that is what makes you a good lawyer, is because you want to essentially, I mean, the clients that come to us are broken, like physically and mentally. They're just done. So that you have that desire to bring some joy into their life, it's huge. It's so important, and it makes you a good lawyer. So I love that answer.
We're both great lawyers.
High five. Well, it was so good talking to you, Raph. I really appreciate you being on here today and sharing your joy. And I wish you the best with everything.
Thanks, Katie. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks, bud. Raphael Castro. That was so awesome talking to him. I think it was really cool when Raph was talking about how he is the son of two immigrants who came over from the Dominican Republic. I mentioned representation when I talked about wanting him to have on the podcast. And I did make a joke about, white guys, but in the legal field, it's been really slow to adding diversity and equity. And Raph is a great example of someone who his parents came over from Dominican Republic, and he's worked so hard to get to where he is. And now he has had jobs where he's in the public sector. He takes civil rights cases, and he helps out injured workers. And it's so important to see someone like Raph, who's out there and is accomplishing so much, and is doing it so young. He's only 30 years old. It was so great talking to him. And it was so interesting also to hear his perspective on the public versus the private sector. And I related to that a lot because I always thought I wanted to go into public interest law. And then when you actually start to practice in it, you see how different it is than what you imagine it to be. And something that's so crucial, which is finances, the public sector really doesn't pay well. And people have to make serious decisions if they're going to stay in the public sector or move to the private sector. And I loved what Raph said about being in the public interest world versus having a public interest mindset. And I think we both really relate to that, in that we both switched over to the private sector because it pays better and it gives us more free time, but we still have the public interest mindset in that we try to go out there and spend our free time helping where we can. But obviously the most important, I think, part of his conversation was when he talked about police reform. And
Raph has a lot of hands-on experience with this, and I loved when he talked about changing the system. And it's from his point of view about getting involved and not just, pointing fingers at the system and saying what's wrong with it, but actually getting involved and trying to work within the system to better it. And part of what we're doing with the Right Legacy with Chris Fox, who will be a guest on the show, is about getting kids involved and inspiring them to want to get involved and to change how things are. And we talked about, Raph and I compared bad police to bad lawyers or bad dentists. And I think we should have qualified. It's obviously not the same thing. A bad dentist may botch your teeth, but it's not the same as what, cops are doing out there to people of color. So, just to be clear that we're obviously not comparing the atrocities that we're seeing with the police brutality to what, other people in a profession who aren't great people are doing. But I agree with him. What he's saying is that you can support the police, but also hold them accountable. And I think the problem is that though you may be having a couple bad eggs with police officers, the system isn't built to hold them accountable. If anything, it's almost promoting the brutality to continue on. And that's what needs to change. It's not just individual police officers. I mean, they're part of the problem, obviously, but it's the police lack of accountability and the immunity that they're afforded. And Raph brought this up. I thought it was awesome. The video content now, that something can happen and within a couple minutes to an hour it's nationwide news, and this didn't happen before. I think we just had the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin verdict came down, and a couple hours later there was another police shooting of a young teenage black girl, and it was shared within hours. And it's just, I don't think that would have happened before we had all of this video content that gets shared within seconds and becomes a nationwide story. So I think Raph offered some really awesome perspective. He's very level-headed and tries to see both sides of an argument. I was so grateful to have him on. I think he's an awesome guy, and he's doing awesome things for the community. So you can check him out. He works over at Eric Shore's office, as he said, in New Jersey and in Philadelphia, but he's very active in the community, always out there doing good stuff, and he's on the board of the Right Legacy with me. So just huge thanks to Raphael Castro for being on the show with us, and you guys can tune in next week for our next guest. So thanks for joining us.